Folks, I'm Doug Page, and today I'm with Karen Gray Houston, author of Daughter of the Boycott, a book that details the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott between December 1955 and December 1956 by the city's 42,000 African American citizens, which lasted 382 days and turned Rosa Parks in many ways into a household name. This is a profoundly personal story and one that keeps you turning the pages too. Karen spent the early years of her childhood in Montgomery, where her father, Thomas Gray Sr., was a founding member of the executive board of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which coordinated the boycott's activities. Her uncle, Fred Gray, a young attorney at the time, represented Rosa Parks and Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. during the protest. He had an incredibly distinguished legal career and was honored by President Biden with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The case over the bus boycott went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in November 1956, it affirmed the decision of the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Alabama, which said the state's law and Montgomery's ordinance mandating segregated busing violated the U.S. Constitution's 14th Amendment. Karen's uncle, Fred Gray, led that charge. Karen, it's wonderful to have you here today. Thank you for coming. I just want to quickly show your book. Uh, there it is. And what a great read it is. Thank you so much for being here. You you spent a lot of time, I sense, on the ground in Montgomery researching the book. What's the one thing about the bus boycott that you didn't know or weren't as cognizant of prior to your starting the research? Was there something in there that sort of said, "Oh, wow, I didn't know that"?
There were a million things in there that I didn't know. I was 4 years old when the boycott started. And, my parents, as I grew up, didn't talk a whole lot about it. What I learned a lot along the way, well, for 41 years through a career, and when I finally started doing the research on the book, I found out things like, hey, there were white allies. There were white people who helped who put their reputations on the line, whose lives were affected. They had their cars vandalized, they were threatened, and I learned that they were willing to do that. I mean, like Clifford and Virginia Durr. He
Sure.
was an attorney who was a mentor to my Uncle Fred and his wife, Virginia Durr. I call them liberal do-gooders.
Right.
And they were willing to help during the boycott. And as a matter of fact, when Rosa Parks was arrested, and E.D. Nixon, the NAACP president who Rosa Parks worked for as a secretary, went to try to bail, well, he called the jail to try to bail her out.
Hmm.
And the white officials at the jail wouldn't talk to him because he was a black guy.
Oh, wow.
So he called Clifford Durr, and Clifford and Virginia Durr went to the jail with him to bail Rosa Parks out. Even though E.D. Nixon put his house up for bail, it took some white people to get her out.
Fascinating.
So, things like that.
Yeah, that's interesting, and that's probably something that maybe a lot of people were not aware of, too, as well. In addition to that, your father played a sizable role in this boycott. Can you just talk a little bit more about that in terms of what you learned?
Well, he was a coordinator of the boycott. He helped put together the carpool. He drove his own car at personal risk to himself to pick up passengers to make the boycott a success. Dad was a businessman at the time. He co-owned a radio and TV repair and sales shop. And my mother was terrified about what was going to happen with him driving his car around. He was eventually stopped uh, while he was picking up passengers and eventually arrested for his activism, along with 88 other people, including Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, blah, blah, blah. So he was just determined to help out, and he did all those things. But 5 years before the boycott, he was even more involved. And this is a story that a lot of people don't know.
Right.
Everybody was mad about how Black people were treated on the buses, sit in the back, and I'll tell you more about how that went on. But 5 years before that, a Black man who was trying to get a ride on a bus in downtown Montgomery was shot and killed by a white police officer.
Right. You mentioned
His name
that.
was Hilliard Brooks.
Right.
Granted, he was drunk and disorderly, and in some of these cases where police brutality is involved, the circumstances are not perfect, but don't warrant you losing your life. And so he tried to get the ride. The bus driver, who had police powers, called the police, summoned a police officer who came over to the bus. And the circumstances are, in dispute, but either the officer got on the bus or dealt with Hilliard on the outside of the bus. And when pushed, according to eyewitnesses, pushed Hilliard to the ground. And as Hilliard tried to get up, he pulled out his gun, shot him, and Hilliard died later at the hospital. My father thought that was outrageous. And so he and a friend of his, they were all, and in fact, Hilliard was also a veteran. They at my dad was teaching a course at St. Jude's Hospital Education Center, and they decided that they were going to do something about it. He and the commander wrote letters to city officials saying just this guy should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law.
Right.
And the police said, oh, it was a justifiable shooting. So they staged a veterans protest that also allowed people to register to vote. So that was 5 years before, and I think set the stage for the boycott because people were already angry
Right.
at how Black people were being treated.
Sure. Sure. And to make this clear, I mean, your father is driving around basically the other African American citizens to their jobs because they basically have decided they're not going to take the bus. That this is the boycott that the group is basically unified as a whole, if I'm correct.
Exactly. And Martin Luther King drove a car and picked up passengers. He was also arrested once for speeding. He was driving something like 30 in a 25.
Uh-huh.
Uh, my dad was arrested. The people came to our house. My mother was terrified when, the sheriff's deputies came to the door and looking for my dad.
Right.
And my dad was in the neighborhood and came by and they arrested him. It was a very quiet and civilized arrest. Dad got in the car. They didn't handcuff him or anything. They were going to pick up another minister of a church on the way. But long story short, 89 people were arrested over a weekend's period of time for their involvement in the boycott, for, driving their cars, for setting up the carpool, for making sure that Black people didn't ride the buses.
So suddenly they decided there's a law that the Black people need to get on the bus, it sounds like.
The law said that Black people, let's just paint a picture of how this all started.
Sure. Yeah.
Black people are angry about how they're treated on the bus.
Yep.
You're a Black person, you get on the bus, you put your dime fare in. And if the bus driver wants, he has police powers, he can tell you not to walk down that main aisle, to sit in the back of the bus, which the law required, that the races be separated.
Sure.
And he could tell you to get off the bus and go around to the side and enter the back and sit in the back.
So
If
this
you
is
wanted,
after you've paid your fare, you have to then get off the bus to re-enter the bus.
you could, if the bus driver says that that's what he wants you to do.
Right. Okay.
So the first 10 seats in the front of the bus, including the two that face each other in the front, are reserved for white people, whether they're on the bus or not.
Right.
So sometimes buses would be full and those 10 seats in the front could be empty, but Black people couldn't sit in them because they were for white people.
Right.
So it was irritating, it was degrading, it was humiliating, and people were fed up about it. And so this is why they finally decided, look, we're going to have a boycott. We're going to break the back of segregation on the buses by not riding. And they almost drove the bus company out of business.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Did your dad ever tell you about how scared he was during this boycott? I mean, I know your mother was scared for your father, but did you ever ask your dad, "Hey, Dad, how scared were you when all this was going on?"
Yeah, my dad was kind of a hothead. I don't think he was afraid. I think he was fearless and would have dared somebody to say something to him. So it was just my mother who felt frightened. And the first day of the boycott,
Really?
she had watched television the night before, and the police commissioner was on TV saying that the police were going to be following the buses because they knew that there were going to be these Black people in goon squads following the buses to make sure Black people didn't ride, which was not true. But she thought that my dad was putting himself in danger, and he had three little children at home. I was four, my other brother was about, what, three, and the other, and we had a newborn in the house. And so she was afraid something would happen to him.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I could see why. I could see why. You know, many people look at the bus boycott today, Rosa Parks really does come to mind. Yet the story in the legal case is a little bit different. Can you just expand on that and talk about how this detail seems to get a bit misconstrued.
What happened? Rosa Parks does get all of the attention. She became the mother of the civil rights movement, but it was really 9 months before Rosa Parks, there were some other instances. Well, one, a 15-year-old girl, Claudette Colvin, refused to give up her seat on the bus. She was dragged off the bus by police and taken to jail and charged with, disorderly conduct and assault on a police officer, violating the segregation law. And there were four other women who also were accused of doing the same thing, but they were not the right person to become the face of the fight for segregation. Little Claudette got pregnant. They didn't want an unwed teenage mother to be who they were battling, who they were fighting for to get rights for Black people. Aurelia Browder, her son says she was too dark and loud. They didn't want her. Susie McDonald was a lady, a very fair, light-skinned lady who looked almost white, and she used to sit in the white section and almost dare the people to tell her to move.
Mhm.
So they kind of felt like, not her. And then there was another young girl, I think she was 18, Mary Louise Smith. The rumor was that her dad was an alcoholic. And so Rosa Parks was perfect. She was soft spoken, very mannerly. She was a seamstress who wore lovely clothes. What people didn't know was that she was an activist and a warrior. But she had been, this whole boycott was planned, and Rosa Parks was waiting for an opportunity that presented itself.
Nice.
She was the secretary of the NAACP, the Montgomery chapter. She was the head of their youth council. Uh, by about that time, my uncle, a year before the boycott, my uncle had gone to law school in Cleveland because, of course, Black people could not attend law school in Alabama. Came back and he was a man on a mission. I'm going to destroy everything segregated I could find. And so part of that involved getting involved with the NAACP, looking for cases that might present themselves. And he met Rosa Parks, and they started meeting at lunchtime in his office. His legal office was close by, down the street and around the corner from the department store where Rosa Parks worked. And they talked about what would happen, what she would do, how she would behave if something bad happened on a bus, because she had had a bad experience before.
Okay.
She was on a bus and the bus driver told her to get off and get on in the back. And she got off and she said, heck no, I'm not getting on in the back. And she let the bus go by. And ironically, that same bus driver was the bus driver who was driving the bus when she was arrested.
Son of a gun. How'd that happen?
Go figure.
Go figure. One of the first things that sort of struck me about your book, in the early pages was that how you sort of described Montgomery shortly after World War II and the Korean War. And it almost seemed like you're suggesting, and maybe I'm reading a little too much in between the lines here, but that at least on the surface, it was a better place for African Americans to live as opposed to the inner city. Yet it's filled with racism, it's filled with discrimination, it's filled with segregation. How did your parents and your uncle describe Montgomery? What did they think of the place?
It was what they knew. It was how they grew up. They lived in the poor side of town, the west side of town. Growing up, they were from humble beginnings. My grandfather died when they were young. Um, Fred was 2 years old when his dad died, and my dad was what, 8. So they didn't have a father, and my grandmother was a domestic who had little education. So they had a rough way to go. They lived in a house that had no indoor plumbing, no electricity. They read by kerosene lights. They had an outhouse in the back. That was the Montgomery that they knew growing up. But they were smart kids. There were 5 siblings in his family, and they were all very smart. And my grandmother emphasized getting an education, and so they all got educated and wanted to bring themselves out of the environment that they were in, and they wanted to change how they were being treated by white people.
Right, right. In which they obviously did that and were very, very successful too as well. As I was preparing for our conversation today, I came across an interesting article from the Case Western Reserve University Law Review. And it discusses something that seems to almost, in many ways, almost gets swept under the rug, is almost an oversight, if you will. And that's the dangers that black civil rights attorneys faced in Alabama. I mean, your Uncle Fred received death threats, bomb threats, even survived a stabbing attack, according to the article. There's Arthur Shores, who's mentioned in the article. He's another prominent civil rights attorney.
Let me
Suffered.
just stop you there. It was King who survived the stabbing attack.
Oh, okay, okay. The way it's written in the article, it talks about your father
oh,
too as well, or your uncle actually, your uncle
yeah.
first. But I mean, this is something that in many ways, you really don't hear about in this story about the fight. And I mean, did your uncle talk about any of this stuff in terms of how he felt about
When
this?
he talked to me about it, I was 4. And then as I grew up, I found that, everybody was living their life. My uncle was being a civil rights attorney. My family was uprooted because my dad also wanted to go to law school. So we were like displaced refugees in our own country. We
Right.
got to move so dad can go to law school. So we moved to Cleveland.
Yeah.
And after we got there, the plan was for him to come back and practice law in Alabama and with my uncle and desegregate everything that needed desegregating. But somehow he was unable to pass the bar exam in Alabama. He could pass the bar in Ohio, but not Alabama. And let me backtrack a little bit. One plan had been for him to go to law school and for the first year for my mom to stay in Alabama with the kids and she was a college educated woman, get a job teaching school
Mhm.
and, hook up with my dad later. Well, when she had her interview for the job, she was asked what relation she was to that lawyer Gray from the boycott. And she said, "Oh, that's my husband's youngest brother." And they said, "Well, that would have to come before the board." So she couldn't get a job teaching. So we had to move and move the family away so dad could get an education.
Well, that's fascinating. That's a good story. Um, Months before, Claudette Colvin, she's arrested basically for the same thing too, as well. I mean, can you, you met with her? What was she like? You talked with her? What sort of comes through about her character, her personality as you were meeting with her years later after this event?
I love Claudette Colvin. I got a real sense of who she was as a kid. She was a smart girl from a poor side of town on a bus that day, and it was March, the month after Black History Month, where she had a favorite teacher who had taught her all about, civil rights and how Black people were being mistreated, and all that stuff was circulating through her brain that day she was on the bus. And she talks about it, as vividly in her 80s as she did when she was a kid. When the bus driver asked for her seat, the bus driver turned around and said, "I need a seat," because the woman was getting on and wanted to sit down, a white woman. And so other people in the row with Claudette got up and moved to the back. Claudette said, "Oh, I have a constitutional right to sit here. This is the colored section of the bus. I'm going to stay right here." So the bus driver called the police over, and the police came in, and she told them the same thing. Well, they dragged her, picked her up and dragged her out, knocked her books down, and they said she was scratching and clawing. Well, Claudette told me she was not scratching and clawing. I don't know what really happened, but they took her to an adult jail. They didn't take her to a juvenile detention center or anything like that. She was totally mistreated. And says that to this day, she didn't get a good break. And she sort of feels like Rosa Parks stole her thunder because she was the first person who got that kind of attention and should have had the support of the community, but she didn't get it. But she's getting her due now, finally.
Yeah.
Um, she went to a court to have her juvenile record as conviction of being a juvenile delinquent expunged.
Wow.
And so that happened a couple of years ago. And ironically, the judge who was in the family court who oversaw the case was an African American. but she got that, and she has had a street named after her in the Bronx where she used to live, and also in Montgomery. And I think there's a development that they're working on that they're probably going to name after her. And she has a new children's book that came out in November.
Oh, very good. Good for her. Well, good for her. So she's done well for herself too, as well, and all that. And one of the things made mention, is it correct, from what I saw here or read, that Rosa Parks came to her aid too as well? And how does she talk
Yes.
about Rosa Parks too? And does she talk about what she was like and what the assistance that she provided?
She did. Rosa Parks was she was the chair of the NAACP Youth Council, and she convinced Claudette to become a member. And after this happened, they were raising money for Claudette because she needed a lawyer to represent her. And so Rosa Parks and her mom would bake cookies, and they were selling cookies to make money to pay the lawyer. And so they knew each other.
Okay.
But I mean, Claudette was a child, and Rosa Parks was an adult. Even though people kind of portrayed her as like a little old lady, she was only 42 years old. I'm just saying. It might have been those wire rim glasses that she wore that made her seem a little older or something. But yes, they knew each other, and what
Sure.
the heck?
Absolutely, absolutely. What's fascinating to me, as I was sort of just going through, just prepping for our conversation, in the ruling about Broder v. Gayle, which is eventually, confirmed and sanctioned by the Supreme Court and outlaws segregated busing, is that I guess if you had to guess, you would never think it would seem to be highly unlikely that anybody would have ever predicted that it's two Alabama judges native to Alabama who say the state is violating the Constitution, and that it's in that group of three judges, it's the youngest judge, Frank Johnson, who at the time is in his late 30s, and the oldest one, Richard Rives or Reeves, I'm not sure how you pronounce the name there, who's about 60, who were aligned in the 2-1 ruling, basically saying this has got to go. And then, after the Supreme Court decision to say yes, it's confirmed. Um, I don't think you could get a better victory than that, than the state basically looking at itself saying, you're wrong.
Exactly. Frank Johnson was a friend of civil rights. And I think that the Supreme Court justices, because the world was watching what was going on in Montgomery, the Supreme Court was watching as well, and that they could see, you know, look, look at how these people presented themselves.
Right.
That protest was a nonviolent protest for 382 days. The Black people didn't do anything to get on the wrong side of the law. And, like Martin Luther King, it was his idea to make sure this was, nonviolent civil disobedience. He was taking his lessons from Gandhi. And he said for sure that would give them the moral high ground, put the white supremacist on the wrong side of the law. And I think the Supreme Court saw that and was sympathetic to it.
Right, right. Have you ever, given your career in media, being a journalist and a reporter, have you ever looked at it from the standpoint of how the media was reporting what was going on, whether the national media ever showed up for anything like this? Have you ever looked at it from that lens?
The national media did show up. What was his name? Frank McGee from NBC was kind of someone who my uncle looked at as kind of a friendly media reporter. I think he was probably the person who gave them the news that the Supreme Court agreed and was going to overturn segregated busing.
Right.
So, but largely earlier on, the story was covered by the Black press.
Okay.
you know, um, the Louisville what's it, Courier Journal. There was a lot of Black newspapers who covered the story, and it after it went on for so long, and then you started seeing things like um, um, the violence that was directed at people, and vandalism.
Right.
Uh, People jumped on board and then they saw Martin Luther King, and what a charismatic leader he was. I mean, he could electrify you with the words that he was speaking, and so he helped capture the attention of the nation and the world to what was going on.
Fascinating. Yeah, fascinating. When you think about that, it's just one of the things you would never think about. You mentioned this earlier. You talk about the money side of this. I mean, a story that I came across, an article that I came across, said that the city of Montgomery lost so much money during this thing, and the estimate that I saw was about $3,000 a day. Of course, there are other estimates too as well, but if it's just 3,000 at a minimum, you would say over the course of 382 days. I mean, that translates to over $1 million, which was a lot of money back then. Certainly is a lot of money today, at least in my eyes. You'd think they would have settled this issue if they had settled peacefully and said, okay. I mean, all the other stuff probably would never have happened.
A lot of hate going on there.
Yeah.
I spoke to the family of the manager of the bus company, City Lines bus company, the Bagleys. Um, they said the bus company was willing to go along with, hey, we've had some other bus companies in other cities and they're integrating the buses. We don't have a problem with this, but they said that the Mayor Gayle said, integration over my dead body. And same thing with the police commissioner. There were racist officials at the top who were not going to turn their back on it, and they were going to, throw this law about segregation up in everybody's face, and they just were willing to continue it, which is insane because they almost lost the business. And they were getting letters. I found out later from the Alabama Department of Archives. Letters got sent from all over the country, mostly from southern places, for sympathetic white supremacists saying, hey, we support you. Here's some money for the cause.
Oh, no
Here's
kidding.
some money to keep the bus company running.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Huh, that's interesting. Yeah, you don't hear about that. I mean, that's for sure. That doesn't come out of the story. Uh,
Mm.
but yeah, that's right. Did they have a sister company down in Mobile, if I'm correct?
There's City Lines was sort of they had I wouldn't call it a national but they had several bus chain companies in several cities. And so there are other cities. There were Mobile had a boycott, wasn't real successful. And where there was another city, Baton Rouge. So there were other cities where bus boycotts happened and they weren't very successful. City Lines was willing to go to the bottom line and say, hey, we want to make money. We don't care if the black and white people sit together on the bus. But they were unwilling to do that in Montgomery.
Right, right. Fascinating. You also had a chance, and you talk about this in your book, to basically, if you will, for lack of a better term, talk to the people who are on the wrong side of history. Have those kinds of conversations. And, you talked to Sarah Jo Bagley, the father-in-law of the bus company in Montgomery, and you talked to others too as well. What was your sense of the people that when you spoke to, I mean, when you spoke to them, what were you learning about their point of view or the point of view of the relative that they knew who had been part of all this?
People were a product of the time, I think. The Bagleys, said that the father and the father-in-law was willing to go ahead with integration. I spoke to some Anne Carmichael, had a black maid. They had to figure out how to get her to work uh, during the boycott and home. And they both had different stories about how that happened because Black Maid was going, well, white people didn't help us. But and then
I did
the
notice that in the book.
Bagleys,
Anne Carmichael had a different point of view.
yeah. And when I sat down first to talk with Ann Bagley, she said, you really ought to be called Negro. I never call you people black. So, that's who she was and that's who but I appreciated that she was willing to sit down and have a conversation with me. And I think a lot of the white people on that side who did talk to me felt that time had gone by and that they were willing to share opinions about how times had changed.
Yeah, interesting, interesting. Did you feel I mean, you've interviewed a lot of people over the course of your career. Did you walk into some of these meetings feeling a little bit nervous, a little bit scared, a little bit wondering it get volatile, or did you think, well, this should be okay?
No, because I felt like they were at an age where they were willing to share information. Anne Carmichael was in her 90s. Ray Watley was a minister. He got booted out of his Methodist congregation in Montgomery for preaching about the evils of segregation. So he admired my uncle Fred. So he was somebody who really had a story that he wanted to get out in public. He's no longer alive, and Carmichael has passed away. There was really some urgency when I was writing the book to get down there and try to talk to whoever was left who had actually witnessed the boycott or participated or been involved. And some of those people are no longer with us.
Sure, sure. When you're on the ground and back in Montgomery, or where you or when you were writing for the book, what was it like to be there? And I asked this question because my father grew up in Springfield, Illinois, way back in the 1950s and 1940s, and my mother grew up in Charles City, Iowa. And when I have sort of visited those towns during my adult years, it almost feels like, I'm walking on haunted ground, sacred ground, if you will. It feels a little bit almost like an out of body experience. Maybe that says that I'm weird. But what's it like when you're there? How do you feel when you're there?
Well, I I lived there till I was 8, and we always went back to see relatives. My grandmother was there, and my uncle Fred and his family, and I had another uncle, and so I was accustomed to it, and I knew the South. I felt like, I, how far beyond segregation have they come? I felt there was still some hostility. I moved back to my grandmother's old house to stay for like a month or so to do some research. And it's on the edge of this like very wealthy community. And I would walk around to the um, a bar in the neighborhood. It's like a gathering place because I used their Wi-Fi, right? I needed the Wi-Fi. I would go buy a beer and sit at the counter and, type by whatever. And people would come over to me like, who are you? And like, why are you here? What are you doing? And, I told people I was working on a book, blah, 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 blah. And somebody told me, you should talk to my father. He was connected with Alabama State when we ran the college. I'm like,
Wow.
oh, okay, thank you. I talked to a young man and his son, a young son, at a little cafe that people went to. Who told me to go there? Sally Mosier, the police chief's commissioner's daughter, the racist commissioner's daughter, told me, go to this little place and everybody goes there, all the politicians and the lesbians, and you got to meet some people who can give you some sense of what's happening in Montgomery. And I sat at a table with a this young man, and I was saying, hey, it's going to be the 60th anniversary of the Montgomery bus boycott. And what do you make about all that? And he said, I think they're stirring up the pot. It's a whole lot of trouble about stuff that I didn't have anything to do with. When do we finish paying for the sins of our fathers? And I said, I don't have an answer for that.
Fair enough. I don't think anybody does. I mean, it's anybody does. Exactly, exactly. Yeah, it must have been kind of like, I mean, I can only guess what it was like, but it seemed like some of these shows where I watched where they interview the ex-Nazi, and or was a member of
Can
the.
you be an ex-Nazi?
I don't know if you can be an ex-Nazi or not, or was associated certainly with them, during World War II and prior to the war too as well. I mean, sometimes I guess some are regretful. You never quite know why they're regretful. They might just be who they are, what they are, too, as well.
Well, I joined a couple of civic organizations while I was there, the Friendly Supper Club and One Montgomery. And they both were groups that grew out of some racial strife that had happened in the city years before.
Hmm.
Um, and their philosophy was like, we're welcoming anyone who wants to come in. We think, we don't have an agenda we want to talk about. We just think if Black and white people or, people of color will just sit down together and have conversations, we can avoid some of the racial tensions that are out there.
Right.
And so those were very helpful meetings for me. And I actually met some people who I ended up interviewing by going to like One Montgomery. They meet once a week for a breakfast meeting, and they invite newsmakers and politicians and people in. They and who did I meet? I met the police commissioner's daughter at one of those meetings. I met the editor-in-chief at the Montgomery Advertiser newspaper. And we chatted, and he said, well, let's have lunch. And we talked, and he wanted to hire me as a reporter at the newspaper. I said, I just spent 41 years as a journalist. I'm done with that. And so he said, well, I think that they didn't really have any Black reporters.
Uh,
And he wanted to have somebody do it. And I said, well, you know what? He said, you're a native of Montgomery. We have an opinion page, an opinion column called Alabama Voices. You could contribute to the opinion page. And so I did that for about a year. And I used it to talk about racial issues and, whatever I could think of. And it gave me an entree to meet people. I'm working for the paper. So it was a good experience.
well, good for you. Good for you. When you think about where the United States is today when it comes to discrimination, racism, segregation, where do you think we are?
I am so afraid. I think we're backtracking now. Things were, let's see, where did we start? When I got into the news business, I rode in on a wave of minority hiring. People were forced to hire us because, one, I think after the summer riots in 67, they wanted Black people who, newspapers wanted to cover the stories and they thought Black people could be helpful. Then you got some community groups and people like Jesse Jackson who were threatening people's licenses and were wanted them to have parity of hiring of minorities with the population in the city. And so they were threatening boycotts.
Right.
And so people like me got jobs because, folks didn't want to be on the wrong side of a boycott. And it was great. But then we would get there and he was like, I didn't really want to hire you, but I had to. So I'm not going to give you a great job. You're going to get you can cover the Black news, or I'm going to give you the undesirable schedule, that kind of thing. And so, as that has evolved to where you turn the TV on now and, we're all over the place and there are Hispanic people and some Asian people, but there's still issues. I mean, it's like, the struggle continues, I think is the answer to your question.
Yeah. I'm not surprised to hear that answer. I mean, I think the struggle does continue. I'm not sure the struggle ever ends either, by any means. Maybe it does. I mean, it's hard to say. Let me ask you this: are you writing any other books? Is there anything on the horizon that you're
They
looking to do?
always want to know that.
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
Okay, so here's my answer. I've been doing some research and a little writing, and I have some ideas and thoughts about what I want to do. And I have my agent with a bat over my head, crack up, saying, time for something new. So there could possibly be something coming.
Good. Good for you. Good for you. Well, Karen, I am so glad you could make the time today. I loved this conversation. Very much enjoyed it. Thank you so much for being here. And I hope to come back if you write that book. I mean, it would be great to read it and hear your discussion about it too as well. It would be a lot of fun. So,
I enjoyed this as well, and thank you for your interest in a story that is continu. Well, here's what's happening with the Daughter of the Boycott.
yeah,
It's a history book. It's memoir, but it's history,
right.
and it resonates on anniversaries like Black History Month
Sure.
and Martin Luther King's birthday and Rosa Parks' birthday and the anniversary of the Montgomery bus boycott. So, and it's doing well. So I'm happy.
Good for you. I'm so glad. Good for you. If you're going to put all that effort into the book, at the very least, there ought to be some money on this money coming forward. And you obviously put a lot of effort into the book too, as well. That's what comes through all the way. Well, look, Karen, thank you so very, very much. I look forward to speaking with you at some point down the road. And this has been a pleasure and a joy. And thank you so very, very much. You've offered a lot of insight. Books always get confined. Nobody ever wants to talk about that, but there they are. And obviously, lots of stuff that goes on here. There's a lot of stuff that goes on here and here too, as well in the book. And it's a fascinating thing in terms of the additional material and stories you were able to share. It just makes it that much better too as
I'm
well.
glad to hear you liked it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, thank you so much. All right, I will see you. We will do this again. All
Okay, bye bye.
right, bye bye.